So we are up to session 7, natural theology. Let me show you a roadmap for today. Two main problems. We're going to talk about God, the existence of God from reason, and the attributes of God, ways to talk about the attributes of God. And then we're going to look at some contrary arguments. I'm going to do that in the form of looking at that blog post from Sean Carroll, where he recaps several common arguments. And then we're going to look in particular at the problem of evil. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between propositional belief and existential belief and why that would be important to us. First, we're going to jump right in with the excerpt from David Hume from his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding and what he says about miracles. So what does anybody have any thoughts or ideas here about Hume's idea of miracles and how it might be similar to or different from the Catholic idea?
Well, I think he had a reasonable argument saying that a miracle, in order to be shown as a miracle, you have to go through some steps to make sure that it's not something that it can't be attributed to other causes. So in that respect, I think that follows the Catholic view. But I read it to say he was kind of also saying, well, since we know a priori that things can't happen outside of the natural laws, therefore we can pretty much dismiss miracles because they can't happen. And that's kind of the logic I saw.
Yeah, that's an important point too. That's what it seemed to me like. He basically defined miracles out of existence.
Yeah.
Defined them in such a way that it's impossible to validate them. So if let's start with the first sentence of it. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. So what do we think about that now? Knowing about nature and God's role in nature, then what do we think about his definition of a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature, and how might we adjust that or correct it?
Well, it's not necessarily a violation. It's an extension. It's a I don't want to use the term supernatural. I could use it's a supernatural extension of the laws of nature. He doesn't quite violate them. I mean, bringing a guy back from death is more of a extension of it, or I don't want to say negation of it, because then I'm playing into his definition. But he sort of, he sort of, takes God out of the picture. Said, there's nothing metaphysical going on here. Nothing metaphysical can happen. Everything has to be physical. So if it's not physical, then it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could also, going along with that line of thought, you could say that God is using an additional set of laws that we're not aware of or privy to. Like you could say airplanes can't fly. Yeah, I mean, they can't. But if you start, if you start incorporating the laws of aerodynamics, then planes can fly. But normally they don't.
Right. So if anybody happened to look, and I encourage you to do this, if you go to the other link that I have there in question 4 from Aquinas on Summa Contra Gentiles, he remarks that sometimes that the word miracle comes from a word meaning wonder. So it's tied to that wonder. We can go back to the beginning of our seminar about the concept of wonder, and where something happens and the cause is in some way hidden from us. And in some cases, the cause is hidden from us in a qualified way. In other words, like you're saying, Marty, somebody who never thought that a man-made thing could fly could see an airplane and be overtaken with wonder about that, but then learn about how that works in nature, and that would resolve that wonder into knowledge. But then there's an unqualified kind of wonder where it's impossible for us to comprehend how something works in a certain way, and that is that's a miracle. Now, Dad, I think supernatural is on the right track, because it's not exactly natural as we conceive
Right.
it. It's not exactly, but it's not unnatural either,
Mhm.
right? Because nature operates in accordance with God's plan, which is reasonable, right? So if something is unnatural, if we define a miracle as something that's contrary to the laws of nature, then we're saying that in a miracle, God operates contrary to his own operation, which is a contradiction. So there's another way where, even if we were going to try to take Hume's definition of miracle, which I think that probably a lot of even religious people might just automatically do, and say that seems to be, that seems to be like a good definition how we might understand a miracle. But even if we took that, that there's a contradiction inherent in it. So Aquinas, if you go on to look at that Summa Contra Gentiles, it's in part 3 of Summa Contra Gentiles, chapter 101 and following on miracles. He defines 3 ranks of miracles. One where something is done by God which nature could never do. So that's the highest rank. And then on the lowest rank, the third rung would be something that is usually done by the working of nature, but is done in this case without the operation of nature. Okay, so an example of this might be a healing, a simple healing. So the example Aquinas uses is a person may be cured by divine power from a fever, which could be cured naturally. Now, in the middle, in between those, is where God does something which nature can do, but not in the order of nature. And it's just sort of an in-between place between those two. So anyway, I think it's just a good distinction to think here about what is natural, supernatural, unnatural, and done by divine power. And that when God operates over and above the natural order of things, that's supernatural. That's not unnatural. That's not contrary to nature, because contrary to nature would be contrary to God's order. So that's just a distinction here that I think will be important going into things. So let me bring my screen back up.
John, he wasn't a Christian, was he?
Who? David Hume?
David Hume? Yeah.
No. So David Hume was an atheist. There was apparently a watch. There was a vigil held on his deathbed to see if he would finally convert and admit the existence of God, and he never did. He is really the philosophical hero of another thinker we'll see in a little bit, Sean Carroll.
Right.
So
The reason,
not a believer.
well, the reason I ask is because I didn't have the hard copy, and so I clicked on the link, and I didn't realize that I wasn't supposed to read like 20 pages.
Oh,
So instead of page 50, I skipped, I mean, I read it through it, but it said on page 57 and 58 that he said tradition and scripture are from the apostles. He said their word contradicts our senses, and our senses have more evidential power, and not everyone has the operation of the Holy Spirit that they claim to have. So he said that the evidence of human testimony is based on our own experiences. So our final standard should be based on experience and observation, not on what other people say. So
right.
that's why I asked. I didn't know. I thought, is this guy a former Christian or what? Because he's obviously familiar with reading the scripture, right?
Yeah, well, he comes in the philosophical tradition, the academic philosophical tradition, for the most part, at that point, was largely religious.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So now we're going to take a look at God, arguments for the existence of God, some traditional proofs. First, the classic approach of Aristotle in his Physics and Metaphysics. Then we're going to look at Anselm's ontological argument, which you looked at a little bit in session 5, I think it was. Then we're going to look at Aquinas's famous 5 ways. Then my dad is going to take over and tell us about modern evidence for the existence of God from modern science. Then we're going to talk about some of the difficulties in talking about the attributes of God, and especially about the importance of analogical language and what that means in our speaking about God. So jumping into God's existence. First, Aristotle comes to the existence of God. Now, he doesn't call, God is not Aristotle's word. And the thing to note here is that Aristotle does not set out to prove the existence of God. The subject matter of his physics is motion, matter in motion, and nature. So what he's looking at is the ultimate principles of everything that is. And the existence of an unmoved mover, the demonstration for an unmoved mover, comes in the context of that. It comes in the context of finding an ultimate principle for all matter in motion. So he's not starting with a concept of God and then seeking to prove or disprove it. And this is often what modern approaches to atheism or theism do. They often start with an idea about God and then try to prove or disprove that idea. Aristotle goes the other way. He's looking at nature and then comes up with the fact that there must be this unmoved mover. To Aristotle, in the physics, because he's talking again about the principles of material things, he does not extend to anything beyond just the existence of this entity. And then it's later in the metaphysics that he goes on to investigate it more, because that goes deeper than the physics into those principles. And finally, it's important to note that for Aristotle, the unmoved mover is a cause, is a mover, but not a creator. So to Aristotle, he believed that time was eternal, that motion was eternal. And there's no evidence to him for a beginning to time. So it's a little bit complicated to try to bring out how he can say that this thing is this mover is a cause of motion, but not a creator. So I'm not going to rehash that here, but I will see if I can find a concise explanation of that to send out later. So going on from there, in the metaphysics, the subject of metaphysics is being itself and the causes of being. So here he's going to be eventually looking at that unmoved mover in more detail. Now, for Aristotle, he believes there are many unmoved movers that exist in a hierarchical community, and his evidence of this is based on his understanding of the heavens. And again, this is a complicated argument, which I'm not going to get into right now, but maybe at the end, if if there's time and you're interested, we can talk about that more. But for Aristotle, God, this primary mover, is he extends further in the metaphysics beyond what's in the physics to an unmoved mover, to a prime actuality. So that there must be something that is pure actuality, that has no potentiality, that all physical, that all natural things have. And we'll see that argument come back with St. Thomas as well. This being is a source of order in the universe, so a kind of providence, the source of the unity of everything else, and in a way the source of those forms. Now for Aristotle, this thing, this being, is the highest and most intelligible thing that is. So what is the highest and most intelligible thing going to think? Well, it's going to think itself. So Aristotle comes up with this phrase, thought thinking itself, and this is a way that he describes this being. And this is important, I think, too. It moves other beings not by force, but by being their highest good, by being an object of love and desire. So he gets to this by thinking, okay, this thing is not a natural thing. This is not a physical thing. So it can't move things the way physical things move each other, by touch, right? But how else can something be moved? It can be moved by being an object of desire. So this thing, this being, moves by being an object of desire, the highest good of what it moves. Now, finally, it's important to note, too, that for Aristotle, this is an impersonal, distant being. Okay, there's nothing like the personal God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is interested in human affairs. But note, again, this is also a difference from even the ancient Greek pantheon, where there were all sorts of anthropomorphic gods, which were part of the universe, not principles of it, and which were intimately involved in human affairs.
John, question?
Yes.
On the part of moving other beings not by force, but by being their highest good, by being an object of love and desire, does that apply only to sentient beings? Or, I mean, how would you bring that down to trees or, you know,
So, yeah, so
your single cell amoebas?
The motion that Aristotle has in mind here is actually not the motion immediately of those natural things, but of heavenly bodies. So for the ancients, the planets, for instance, moved in perfect circles, or they moved in combinations of perfect circles, and these were in at the end of the physics. Aristotle argues for why he says that these are candidates for an eternal kind of motion, that the motion in a circle is the only type of motion that can exist for eternity. Basically, he goes to show, first, that time can't have a beginning. Second, that that the only kind of motion that could be eternal is motion in a circle. And then third, he looks around in the universe to see, okay, what kind of things have motion in constant motion in perfect circles? Well, it's the heavenly bodies. And the heavenly bodies for Aristotle are not just big chunks of earth floating around in the heavens, but they have a kind of soul, not the same kind of soul of that we talked about at the beginning of the ethics, where we had our little crash course on philosophical psychology, where there's a vegetative, sentient, and then a rational soul. But this is something unique to the heavenly bodies.
Okay.
And so it's the heavenly bodies that move. Then the hierarchy is such that there is an outermost sphere of the heavens, and that sphere is the one which has the highest mover that provides order for all that it contains. So so the motion of, so Aristotle does not go to the extent that St. Thomas does in showing that this being is directly the highest good of all things that exist.
Okay.
Okay, so let's take a look at St. Anselm's ontological argument. So basically, here's the way this argument proceeds. The concept of God is as a being than which nothing greater can be imagined. Okay, so you have a concept of God, and the concept of God is a being that nothing greater can be imagined than this being. That is what the concept of God is. Now, we have a mental concept of God. True. Okay, I have a mental concept of God. Number 3, a being that exists just as a mental concept, or a being that exists as a mental concept and reality is greater than one that exists just as a mental concept. Okay? So if God is only a mental concept, then we can imagine something greater. We could imagine something that's not just a mental concept, but also actually exists. But from number 1, we said that God is something that we can't imagine something greater than God. Therefore, God must exist. Existence is implied by the very fact of our having an idea of God. Okay, so what's right or wrong here? Are you convinced?
I don't see that logic as flowing. A being that exists is both a mental concept and a reality is greater than one. I don't see how that would prove the existence of God.
So what he's saying.
It sounds like a circle.
Yeah,
I was just going to say that.
line 4 seems to be the hinge where it falls. Whether we can imagine something greater or God or not wouldn't create its existence. So whether we can think of a planet bigger than Jupiter has no bearing on whether such a planet exists.
So
This seems to me an argument that if God exists, he is the greatest thing that could exist.
Right. So there's right now I'm going to go to Aquinas' critique of this argument, and then we're going to come back to it in a little more detail later when we get to Descartes, because Descartes has his own version of this, which was in the readings as well. Okay, so Aquinas says, and this is from the Summa, perhaps not everyone who hears this word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, so it doesn't follow that someone who uses the word God or has some concept of God understands that what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Okay, so we have here a distinction between logical existence or a logical category and ontological or real. Okay, so just because we can have an idea of something does not imply that it exists the same way, really. Now, when we're talking about existence, this is going to go back to the fact from our metaphysics portion that that existence is meant in many different ways, and existence applies differently to God than it does for us. So we're going to come back to this with Descartes. But Jerry, I think what you were getting at the end, I think it was you who were saying that it's qualified that if God exists, then this argument works. If you already start with an understanding that God exists, then this argument works. But it relies on us presuming something that is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. So it's another way. Yeah, I'm going to come back to that again more with Descartes, but it's an important argument in the history of philosophy. So it's important to see how, at least in a general way, it works. Now let's go to St. Thomas. And again, something significant to note here is that the way this is laid out in the Summa, that was part of your reading, is an extremely abbreviated version of these arguments. Okay, so he's laying out main points in the, for example, what he does in basically one paragraph, he does in Summa Contra Gentiles over about 35 paragraphs. Okay, so I'm already answering one of my questions here and saying these are not really meant in their form here to be good street arguments for you to pull out immediately and go through like this. It takes something much more detailed than that. But what are your questions or observations or summaries? Could you summarize one or more of these arguments here?
Let me try it in a different way. The only one that really strikes me is the uncaused cause.
Okay, so the second one.
If anything exists, how is it that it exists?
So in his second one, which is from the perspective of efficient causality, he says here, there's no case known in which a thing is found to be, let me pull this up actually. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so he says, oops. He says there is no case known in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. In other words, for something to come into being, something that's not currently actively existing can't bring itself into existence. It needs some other cause. But it's impossible to go on to infinity for there to be no first efficient cause, because if there's no first cause, then there's no first effect, or you could say no second intermediate cause. But the fact that we look around and we see things caused to come into existence shows that there are things happening, that there is causality around, and so there must be a first cause.
This is how you split or solve Aristotle's question of whether or not the universe is eternal. And it can be eternal or not, because that's separate and distinct from how is it that it exists.
Yeah, Aristotle didn't think of efficient causality quite the same way as St. Thomas did. So that would be, St. Thomas definitely has a development out of Aristotle's thought on this score. So we could definitely say that St. Thomas takes what Aristotle ended with and continues it, following reason. Now, I think the first two are probably the most well-known, the unmoved mover and the uncaused cause. But what about the third, fourth? I think really the third and fourth ways might be a little bit more interesting. So the third way in possibility and necessity, and the fourth way in the gradation of things. Any ideas here of what he means about the argument from possibility and necessity?
Couldn't that be thought of as potency and actuality?
That is actually how he approaches the first way, is by means of potency and actuality. But it's a little bit.
This is contingency and non-contingency?
Yes. Yeah.
If your contingent being doesn't have to exist, the fact that you don't have to exist, you know, you had to come into existence from something else. There has to be something that does have to exist in order for anything to exist.
Now, how does St. Thomas argue that exactly?
Every time I try to figure out how St. Thomas argues something, I tend to try to reformulate it in my own words so that I can understand it.
So let's look at the key parts of his argument here. So he says there are things that we find in nature that are possible to be and not to be. Okay, these are contingent things. So they're generated and they corrupt. So they're possible to be and not to be. Okay. So then he says, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Nothing at all. Okay? If everything that exists is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing.
Which would mean that since nothing comes from nothing, there is nothing.
Right. So now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist, as you said, only begins to exist by something already existing. So if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd, of course, right? Because we exist, right? So not all beings, he says, are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. Do you follow this argument?
It sounds like the BVG theorem that your father's going to teach us.
Oh, no, it's not that complicated.
I can follow it, but at the same time, it sounds a lot like the same argument as uncaused cause. It's a necessity that something exists in and of itself, qua existence, in order for anything else to come into existence.
Yeah, I think as far as its similarity to the other argument, all five of these arguments are basically structured the same way. And but they start with different kinds of observations. One starts with the observation of motion. The second starts with the observation of causality. The third starts with the observation of contingency. The fourth starts with the observation of the gradation, as he says, to be found in things. That there's more and less of things, but that there must be some ultimate standard by which these are judged. And then the fifth comes with the observation of intelligence in the world. Okay, so they're basically structured the same way, and he ties them in together a lot more, I think, if you look at Summa Contra Gentiles. So that part of Summa Contra Gentiles, what is it? I don't have I think it's book 1, Summa Contra Gentiles, starting with chapter 13. He talks about the existence of God. So any other questions on these?
I find his argument, the uncaused cause, irrefutable. At least for me, when I've had discussions about people who say there are no God, and I phrase the question to them that way, so the end of the discussion. There's no answer.
Starting with David Hume, in modern philosophy, there's a skepticism about the reality of causality. And
there's a skepticism about the reality of reality.
Yes, I'm not trying to refute you. I'm just trying to explain that that because of the deep philosophical skepticism that's pervaded since then, that the argument from causality doesn't now have the force that it used to.
So what is the refutation of that argument then?
Well, the refutation for David Hume is to say that that causality is basically just it's the operation of reason by induction. That it's not a real operation in things, but it's that we see patterns, and that over time we form those patterns into rules, which we call the laws of nature, but that we don't have any direct experience of those rules and laws, and so we don't ultimately really have a right to say this is an actual cause, but that it's just a convenient way that we talk about the world.
I don't see the force of that argument.
How is that a refutation other than just
Yeah,
refusal to
I don't
discuss it?
see how that would refute.
Well, because it denies basically our ability to recognize causality in the world. It says we can't prove that causality actually exists. There are
Well,
just sequences of events.
If a baseball hits a bat and the ball goes springing over the fence, you can't say that the batter hit the ball, knocked it over the fence.
That's right, exactly. You can, for the sake of convenience, say that, but for Hume, he would say you can't see the causality. You see a sequence of events, but you can't see the bat. You can't see this invisible notion of causality. You see events happening, and so another form of evidence.
I can't see the invisible notion of his thinking.
I mean, science is based on the fact of causality. How would he then answer scientists who'd say, if I can't see the cause, I got nothing to do here. I'm out of a job.
Well, I think there's a basic basic epistemological problem with the argument. But I think he formulates it much better than I do, because obviously I don't agree with it. So I'll send out links to that, and maybe some modern versions of that tomorrow. And that
Okay.
would be interesting to look at.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm going to hand it over to my dad. Are you ready, Dad?
Yeah, the basis here that we've been talking about is, and I was going to interject in the last conversation with Hume, is the separation between philosophy and science. And Ratzinger, Benedict points this out in his lecture at Regensburg, that at a certain point with the Enlightenment there became a separation between the two, and you also pointed it out at the very beginning, I believe, of our series, is that you run into the philosophers who are very, very good philosophers, except not you, somebody else did, but they don't really look beyond their own expertise. They're very good at what they're doing, but they don't see anything else. So this is a scientific evidence of an intelligent creator. You notice I'm not saying it's a scientific evidence of the proofs of the existence of God, because we can only go back a certain point, as I'm going to point out, to the 10 to the minus 43rd second after the Big Bang. We can't go back scientifically beyond that point. Go ahead, flip to the next slide. Good. I wanted to point out there's a couple. A lot of this stuff came from Spitzer's New Proofs of God Existence. But Francis Collins is the current director of the NIH. He's the one that did the Human Genome Project, which basically mapped out the DNA of the human. And he wrote a book called The Language of God: Scientific Evidence for the Belief. A good source. It's very readable. It's it's not nearly as deep as Barr's book, or even Chris Baglow's is a high school textbook. Very difficult to read. I mean, I can't believe high schoolers are reading stuff like that. And the last thing it's not on this slide, but the Father Spitzer, the Magis Center website, magiscenter.org, has many stuff on this. Go ahead. There it is. Crediblecatholic.com is where you can go to get the 7 modules of that every Catholic should know, that Spitzer's come up with. And if you really want to have some fun, download the Big Book. It basically explains all the proofs that we've been talking about, that we're going to be talking about in all its wonderful splendor and glory, as only Spitzer can do it. And if you don't want to do quite the big book, you can get the little book, which is on there for he's got everything on there. Go ahead. I'll skip it. Now we're gonna do the Big Bang model, and there's 4 speculative theories that basically the Big Bang or the BVG proof disclaims or proves against. And one is the multiverse hypothesis. If you've heard Spitzer talk about this, he continually Big Bang is a model. All these rests are hypotheses which have been disproved by various evidence. And exactly the thing we're going to talk about with Carroll. Carroll looks at this and says, hey, I'm in the minority here, so he has difficulty talking about this, but he's basically in the minority. We're going to talk about second law entropy, and then the various proofs. Go ahead. Now it's going to be sort of a historical walk through this thing. Prior to, even Isaac Newton believed in an infinite universe. So you're talking in Newton's time. that nobody really thought about the universe. You know, Thomas had these philosophical reasons for the proofs of the existence of God, but nobody's really looked at it from a scientific point of view. It was in 1914 when Slipher basically did a study, and he sort of noticed that everything were moving away from the Earth at a rate of about 2 million miles per hour. And then in 1916, you know, again, just 100 years ago, Einstein's equations of theoretical physics came up, energy and mass. And the second one is very important. Energy and mass are both indestructible and uncreatable, which Einstein proved with his E is equal to mc squared, which basically showed that if you look at the whole universe, nothing's destroyed and nothing more is created. So everything must have been there or must be there. He also talked about gravity and the warping of time and space. But the other thing is he tied time and space together, which he was the first one to do that, so he went beyond what Newton did. Hubble and Hume in 1929 basically took Slipher's stuff and expanded it to look at many, many galaxies and noticed that they were all moving away. And so Hubble, and now it's called the Hubble-Lemaitre law because of Lemaitre's proof of it. When you extrapolate this, everything's moving away from a certain point. If you extrapolate back, there must be a singular point of origin of the universe. Go ahead. Then Lemaitre in 1927, a Catholic priest, solved the equation. You ought to read about this. This is really great stuff. Einstein had to put a fudge factor in because Einstein just thought of an infinite universe. So in his equations, I call him a fudge factor. He put a constant in there, and Lemaitre proved it didn't belong there, that Einstein was really right at the beginning. And the two of them got together, and Einstein has some wonderful quotes about that God must have been behind this whole creation of the universe. And then Wilson and Penzias came about in 1965. Notice the difference in time here. This is 1965 now. Nobody's been able to really show this really happened. Well, they were out playing around. They were looking at a telescope, and they were looking at they were trying to look at the cosmos. And they noticed that there was some background noise that they couldn't get rid of. And no matter where they looked, this background noise was there. They won the Nobel Prize in 1978 for it. And it was basically cosmic background radiation, basically left over from the Big Bang. And no matter where they looked, whatever direction they looked, they kept on seeing this. And then finally in 2013, now again, notice the difference. 2003, Born, Vilenko, and Guth proposed the BVG theorem. And to make it really simple, they basically said that no matter which universe or multiverse existed, as long as the Hubble constant was greater than zero, then there had to be a singular event. And this basically knocked out all the other arguments for any theory of the universe other than the singular origin of the universe. Go ahead. Yeah, Collins in the Language of God, and I got to wipe out this so I can read it. At the point of time at the beginning of the universe where the laws of physics break down, and we can go back to the first 10 to the minus 43rd second. And scientists are able to go back to that point, which is the earliest event of the explosion. After that, it's possible to make predictions about the events that would have needed to occur to result in today's observable universe, blah, 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 blah. That's in the language of God. So that's why I say we can only go back to a certain point. At that point, we have to apply metaphysics and say, well, somebody had to create this to be outside of the universe in order to do that. So this is Collins. Go ahead.
So Dad, just to clarify there, so by that singularity, that means that we have no concept of what kind of laws of physics, if any, were in operation before the first 10 to minus 43 seconds of existence of our universe.
That's correct. And we can use the current laws of basically of quantum mechanics and relativity to go back to that 10 to the minus 43rd second. Incredible. I just picked up a book, Wrinkle of Time, George Smoot and Keeley Davison, and they got a chart in there. They say this is what happened at 10 to the minus 43rd second. This is what happened at 10 to the minus 30th second. You can't even imagine these times. And basically go ahead. I won't. I'm getting ahead of myself. There's 4 speculative theories: multiverse, bouncing universe, pre-Big Bang, and the string theory. They've all been disproved by the BVG theorem. Go ahead. Now, entropy is a good one. Entropy, the second law of physics, the second law of thermodynamics. Anybody that had thermodynamics in college, you studied entropy to the death. In an isolated system, entropy, which is disorder, always increases or stays the same. It never goes down. Dead bodies decompose; they don't recompose later. If I drop my wine glass off my desk right now and it shatters, there's no law of physics that will say that it's going to come back to its place. So certain procedures only happen in one direction. They're irreversible procedures, and it's a process that flows from the past to the present to the future. And you can't have a perpetual motion machine, as anybody knows that's studied any sort of mechanical engineering. So when you have an expanding universe that's going back, it can't contract. It can't turn around and go in the other direction. Go ahead. And this is the proof. It's you can pretty much read it. It's been in your notes. Let's just go on. Yeah, basically, therefore, the universe could not have existed for an infinite amount of time. It must have had a beginning. Because everything, again, my wine glass sitting on the desk, the beginning of it, it's sitting on the desk. The end of it, it's crashed on the floor. It must have a beginning. And Einstein says that there's one law of physics that will always be irrefutable, and that is a law of entropy, second law of thermodynamics. Go ahead, John. And so Lamontre says that the further galaxies from us, the greater it's speeding away from us. This is a stretching balloon example. At the very beginning, they thought it was more of a cone going out, a conical, but Lamontre shows, and this has to do with Einstein's relativity, the warping of the forces. It's really a stretching balloon. You blow up a balloon, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And as it blows up, so the reverse of it, it comes down back to a singular point. The relative velocity of an object approaching a more distant galaxy will be less than the relative velocity approaching a nearer galaxy. They use this is the red shift versus blue shift, which is basically the Doppler effect, as we know it. We hear an ambulance coming to us, it comes at a higher frequency, and as it goes away, it goes at a lower frequency. So since the galaxies are moving away, the relative velocities are slowing down. And this is because of entropy. This was the BVG theorem. Go ahead. I forget what's on the next slide. Yeah, if all this is happening, therefore the relative velocities are, when you run this thing backwards, the relative velocities are approaching the speed of light, and nothing we know of thus far, we may find something later, can go faster than the speed of light in a relativistic system. Therefore, the past time of our universe could not proceed back further, and it represents the beginning of the universe. That's how they're able to calculate how long the universe has been in existence. Go ahead. Fine-tuning anthropology. Go ahead. Let's move on. Next one. Man, this is important. John Paul II, in a letter to, I don't know, it was some 100th anniversary of Galileo or somebody, right after he became Pope, 10 years after he became Pope, he talks about the contemporary physics furnishing a striking example of the quest for a unification of all four fundamental forces: gravitation, electromagnetism, the strong and the weak nuclear interactions. And he's basically saying that, in this, Einstein sort of talked about this, but they haven't been able to figure it out. The theorists figure that at one time, at the Big Bang, prior to, or at the moment of the 10 to the minus 43rd second, all the fundamental forces were joined together and then they split apart, which is really phenomenal for a Pope to say something like that. And it's turning out sort of to be true as we understand more and more. Go ahead. And I'm mentioning this because when we talk about the anthropic coincidences, there's a group of scientists, and Carroll may be of this group, that basically says, hey, the universe just happened to turn out this way. You have Planck's constant. Look at these numbers. Look at how small or large these numbers are. You have the speed of light, 3 times 10 to the 6 kilometers per second. You have the gravitational constant. You have the strong force, weak force. The rest mass of the proton, 10 to the minus 27th kilogram. Rest mass of electron proton charge, 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19th coulombs. Go ahead. Then you have the rest of them. Skip it. Now let's look at the precision of this. On a macroscopic level, the gravitational constant, which is capital G, the gravitational force is equal to m1 m2 g squared g over r squared, the radius between the two, the distance between the two. If that was off by 10 to the minus 30th of a degree, the universe wouldn't be able to bring forth living things. That's a tremendous number. And I've said this when I talk about the origin of the universe to kids. I say, when God created the universe, and he didn't look down and say, hey, gravitation's a little off, so I need to tweak the big gravitation level to keep people from floating away, or something like that. It was perfect. It was perfect from the very beginning. The force that attracts the protons and neutrons, it keeps them together. If they were only off by 5%, we wouldn't have the elements that we have today. And Roger Penrose, he's a mathematical statistician. He took all the probabilities of the coincidences of all the numbers, the constants that I mentioned before, and said, what would happen if that just randomly happened? And the probability of that being true would be 10 to the 10th to the 123rd. Now, my computer wouldn't let me raise the higher, the superscript, another superscript. So it's 10 to the 10th to the 123rd power. You basically can't write that number. And that's where Spitzer describes it as a monkey tapping on a computer and coincidentally precisely typing in all of Shakespeare's works the first time without a mistake. That's the probability of that happening. So the people that say that, well, it could be just coincidence and all these things come together, that's the probability of that happening. Go ahead. So as mentioned before, nothing comes from nothing. If the universe came into existence, the universe, when it was nothing, could not have created itself. Someone would have had to have done that, and that would have transcended, had to have been outside universe in space and time. Go ahead. So this is where the metaphysics comes in. Physics, and I said this at the very beginning, physics can't alone prove a metaphysical conclusion. We can take it back to the 10 to the minus 43rd second, but you have to go a little bit further than that. So if the first premise is from physics and the second premises from metaphysics that goes something like this. If there's a reasonable likelihood of the beginning of the universe, prior to which there was no physical reality whatsoever, and if it is a priori true that from nothing comes nothing, then it's reasonably likely that the universe came from something or someone who was not part of the physical reality, not part of the space-time, out of the reality of the current universe. Next slide, please. So where are we? Physics can take it back to the 10 to the minus 43rd second. Metaphysics can take it back further. At that precise moment, all of the mass energy of the universe is concentrated in space-time. All the relationships that were in place to create a world that can be sustained, that can sustain life 13.7 billion years later, were in place. And a highly intelligent being had to do this. So nothing comes from nothing. Someone had to initiate the bang. That someone had to reside outside the universe, outside space-time. That's someone we call God. I think the next one's the last one. So this is sort of me. So physics goes up to the Big Bang. Metaphysics goes beyond that. But we talk about in the old Baltimore Catechism that God was all perfect, all knowing, all loving, and all knowing, all loving, and all perfect. God always was, always is, and always will be. Well, in order to do that, if this is true, then God has to be outside of the universe. God had to be in place before t = 0. And when he did that, he put everything in place. And we in the world today, and the scientists, specifically the last 100 years, have been able to start piecing this stuff together. And we can go back to that point, and we're finding that nothing changed from the beginning. That he put everything in place at the very beginning, and that creator being an all perfect being caused it all to happen. I think that's it. What's next? Yeah, that's it. So that's it. It's different from what John has been talking to us about. This is pure physics. And Aquinas didn't have advantage of this. Neither did Aristotle. Neither did Isaac Newton, for that matter. So
Thanks, Ted. So a couple of things that I was thinking about here. First, on your slide where it said this being, something like this being we call God. It's interesting that too, St. Thomas uses that language at the end of all of his 5 ways. He comes to the deduction of the existence of some being, and he says this being we call God. Right. So it's first deducing the need logically, and in this case scientifically, for some kind of being, and then giving it a name, and that's what God is. And again, going from that direction rather than starting with an idea of God with all of these attributes, and then trying to prove the existence of that.
Right. We're able to work backwards now.
So then anything that anybody says about what happened before the first 10 to the minus 43 seconds is pure speculation, and there's no way to extrapolate earlier than that according to the current laws of physics. We just don't know what it is. Is that correct?
That's true.
Yeah. So, and I know that there are still scientists who propose the bouncing universe hypothesis, but
absolutely, yeah.
There's no way to prove it. There's no way to have any evidence of it. It's just pure speculation.
Sure.
In Sean Carroll's case, I think he subscribes to something like that. His logic basically is that if we can have a theory that is within our current empirical, that posits an empirical solution to the problem, then we don't need to go outside our universe to posit a supernatural being. And then another odd thing about him, where he says he's in the minority, is that he's a proponent of the idea of a multiverse, where based on the current quantum field theory predictions, that every possibility that can come about according to the statistical possibilities of quantum field theory does actually come about, but each of those possibilities is realized in an actual new universe. So at this point, there are an incomprehensibly many number of universes that are constantly coming into being.
Right, but again, using the BVG theorem and actually Aquinas. I mean, going back to causes, all those had to have a first cause.
Right.
And it's also something that sort of is outside the province of science, because by definition you can't go past the Big Bang to see what's beyond it. And you can't see into the multiverses or other universes causing you,
Mm-hmm.
because you have this wall that you can't penetrate.
Yeah, that's a good point. So any of those statements are, even though they sound like they are part of their statements about modern science, they're really metaphysical propositions.
Yeah, and I found that scientists are really bad philosophers. You would have thought that they could have been good philosophers, but you read Dawkins, you read Krauss, you read even Hawking's, and their metaphysical assumptions were just stupid. Yeah.
Right. When you start going back and looking at these people, Einstein had a preconceived notion that the universe was infinite, until Lemaitre straightened him out. So a lot of these guys have preconceived notions going in, and they fit their physics, their science, to those notions, rather than looking at it from a purely philosophical point of starting without a preconceived notion. Stephen Barr wrote his book. What's Barr's book named? It's on the list. Stephen Barr, by the way, is the Attorney General's brother. Great guy. He's up at University of Delaware. He probably knows philosophy better than most of us, and he's a theoretical physicist. And so theoretical astrophysicist. And but so he's able to balance both of these realms. And more people, Spitzer notes that when you start looking at the scientists that believe in God, it's up over 50% now, where it was not. And again, Ratzinger, Benedict talks about this a little in his what's the problem with modern philosophy. The lack of the existence of belief in God as an original is the going in position, more or less.
Great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to go beyond just the existence of God. How can we come to talk about the attributes of God? So I'm going to preface this by reminding us of a principle I've mentioned multiple times from Aristotle's physics, that in coming to know things, we move from what is more familiar and clearer to us to what is clearer and better known by nature. For instance, when we first encounter a thing, say a person, we have a number of perceptions, of sense perceptions about them. And it's by means of those sense perceptions that we come to know the deeper reality which underlies those attributes, their particular skin color, their eye color, their their hair, their height, and all of those things that are based on something more fundamental. So we start with what's clear to us and then go to what is prior in reality. Now, for immaterial things, Aquinas notes, we can reach them by the light of reason only to the extent that their effects reveal them to us. So there may be a limit there that is not the case with material things. So a consequence of this is that statements about immaterial things are always tied to concepts first formed from things having a completely different mode of being. In other words, we first encounter and name and understand things that are physical and material, and then we use terms that we learn in the process of knowing these things and apply them to immaterial things which have a different kind of being. So that begs the question, well, what is the relationship between the things we are describing, the immaterial things, and the words we use to describe them? And how can we say, in this case, anything true about God if our terminology is derived from an experience of a physical and natural world? So again, from the physics, Aristotle had posited a being that must exist to account for the cosmos as it is constituted or observed. Now, he notes that the essence of this being is not understood by us directly. So it's named as a cause in terms of its effect. So unmoved mover, when we call something a mover, then we're naming it in relation to something that is moved. So we see the thing that is moved, and we name the mover as a cause. We don't understand the mover in itself, so we give it a name that describes it as a cause. Now then also some negations come out of this too in the process of the metaphysics. He'll describe this being as immaterial, so non-material, as being without parts or magnitude, as being not divisible, as being eternal, which means not temporal. So all of these things are attributes that say what this being is not, but not what it is in itself, okay? So it's separating this being from concepts we understand more immediately, materiality, about parts and wholes, about things that are divisible and things that are bound by time. Okay, and then this being transcends us. So we are in actuality, but in a derivative way, because our actuality as persons is also bound up with potentiality. We're not pure actuality. But this being is pure actuality. So we don't know, we can't comprehend in our present mode of understanding the world what a pure actuality is, because we encounter, according to our senses, things that are things that have a mixture in some way of actuality and potentiality. So Aquinas will tell us that we can know God in these three ways. By causality, and that's not to know his causes, but to know him as a cause. And an example here is a statue does not reveal the full essence of the artist, but by seeing the statue, we can know the existence of the artist. So we could see Michelangelo's David and know the existence of somebody that we might name Michelangelo, but by seeing the statue, the effect of that cause, we don't know we don't know the essence of Michelangelo until we encounter him in a different way. Okay, causality, negation, separating God from what we apprehend. So God is not anything that we see with our eyes. God is not the attributes that we attribute of one another and of physical things. Transcendence, that there's a horizon of possibility that we can't cross, but the horizon indicates something beyond that we can't grasp. So God, in this sense, transcends description. So to put these together, God is, whatever you want to say, good or wise or beauty to a degree beyond what we understand, not in the sense of just happening to be more good or more wise than we are, but in his very essence. This is not the case for goodness or wisdom for any of us. Goodness and wisdom are attributes of us. We can be more or less good, more or less wise. God can't be more or less good or more or less wise. He is goodness. He is pure wisdom. He is pure beauty. My other example here was the bird. So you can hear a bird singing outside your window, and you can know that there must be a cause of that song, but without knowing precisely what kind of bird it is, right? So just an example of, that's just an analogy to see where we can see effects of God and know his existence without really knowing fully what he is. So the way to go beyond this, to actually be able to say things about God, is by analogy. So 2 ways I want to show of talking about analogy that Aquinas points out too. The wrong way to use analogy with respect to God is to say that God's wisdom, or man's wisdom, is to wisdom itself, as God's wisdom is to wisdom itself. This would be putting man's wisdom and God's wisdom in the same category. And it would be putting wisdom itself, it would be separating it from God. It would be putting it somewhere outside of God. So the real way to do it is to say God's wisdom is to man's wisdom as the cause or the source is to the effect. All right, so what we call wisdom in man has some ultimate source, an ultimate standard in God's essence. Because wisdom itself belongs in reality to God first, but we come to know it, and this is going back to Aristotle's point about what we come to know first. We come to know wisdom first through derivative forms, through people that we call wise. And then we apply the term to God by analogy. So in this sense, we're kind of stuck with an inferior term, which is nevertheless applied truly. God is truly wise, but he's not wise in the same way that man is wise. Okay, so this would be the case with any positive attribute we apply to God. So beauty, goodness, perfection, life, knowledge, etc. So Aquinas saying here, therefore, because we come to a knowledge of God from other things, the reality in the names said of God and other things belongs by priority in God, according to his mode of being. Okay, so wisdom belongs to God by priority, according to his mode of being. But the meaning of the name belongs to God by posteriority, because we come to know what wisdom is by encountering wise people. We come to know what goodness is by encountering wise or good things and good people. And so in this sense, he is said to be named from his effects. Okay, so this mode of analogy brings together those 3 ways Aquinas says we can talk about God: transcendence, negation, and causality. It separates God's essence from things we properly grasp. So in a sense, and some Christian theologians, especially in the Neoplatonist tradition, Pseudo-Dionysius, that St. Thomas quotes a lot, is an example of this. He'll say, basically, he'll use 2 ways. He'll use 2 ways to talk about God. God is not good, not in the sense of God is not good absolutely, but God is not good as we understand good. But God is super, or God is hyper good. God is hyper wise, but God is not wise. So you have this dichotomy, this contrast where you can get to a closer understanding of what God is by positing something we understand and saying God is far beyond that, and then clarifying God is not that in the way that we understand it. But the connection between these concepts is one of causality. Okay, now even St. Thomas says, even revelation does not give us God's essence. So even though revelation elevates us to know something of which we should otherwise be ignorant, it does not elevate us to know in any other way than through sensible things. Because through revelation, we still get terms that reveal concepts that that are limited according to our mode of understanding. So even with revelation, we're still limited to a confused or unclear concept of God's essence, but something far beyond what we can get through pure reason. Then just a brief summary here. So wisdom is predicated accidentally of man. Man can be more or less wise. Wisdom is predicated essentially of God. So when Jesus says only God is good, we can think of this. Okay, when Jesus says only God is good, that's what he means. Only God is good in the way that God is good. It doesn't mean that we don't share in that goodness in some way. Okay, so if you're, I went into a little bit more detail on analogy here, just because I've done some more research on that than on some of the other things. But any questions on that? Okay, let's take a look at Sean Carroll. So let's start with first, what is Carroll's idea of God? What is his definition of God? What are some attributes of Carroll's God that he's going to investigate?
Can you first tell me, who is this fellow?
He is a physicist and cosmologist.
Is he supposed to be a recognized expert in this field? I've never heard of him, of course I wouldn't. Yes, at least to some extent, yeah. I mean, he's held fairly prestigious positions.
He doesn't define, he says nobody really agrees on the definition of God right off the bat.
Mm-hmm. So then he goes on to say, so when I say God, I'm thinking of something we would recognize. So here's his list. And if you go through, there's more than just what's in this sentence, but things he says about what God is. A conscious being. Okay, so consciousness applies to God, which should first pique your interest. Like, what does he mean by consciousness? That God is important for creation and for the order of the world. That God has supernatural abilities. That God cares about humans. That God plays a role in, and in is important here, in the universe. That God is part of the universe. So what does that tip off for you?
That he's not beyond the universe.
Right. So
Also, there's something greater than God.
yes. Yeah. So the concept of God that he is going to investigate is something that's part of the universe. So this is a case where, like I was mentioning before, that he's starting with a concept and then investigating that concept, rather than going the route that Aristotle did, which was investigate the world and realize that a being of some sort must exist.
But isn't he a humanist? And as such, that makes sense?
Which part makes sense?
God is part of the world.
Yeah. I mean, he's starting off with the idea. He's defining God in a way that is going to make him not be able to exist. right? He's
And it's
making
gonna
God
suit,
part of creation.
it's going to suit his theoretical needs too.
Right. Another point here is he mentions the Aristotelian unmoved mover responsible for creating the universe. Now, is that the Aristotelian unmoved mover that you know, that we talked about, that created the universe?
No, he denies it.
That's right. So Aristotle does not posit creation. So here we have a case where there's, and this is fairly common these days, where people will get their ideas of Aristotle from somebody else, from somebody else, from somebody else.
Mhm.
And Aristotle and Aquinas are kind of mixed up. So, so he's obviously not read Aristotle. He's not engaging with Aristotle's arguments, but with an idea that he's ascribing to Aristotle, which isn't true.
Something that I got out of this reading is that I think could possibly be a little bit of a dig at Christians or any religious person, is that we ourselves don't always have a very good definition of who God is. And it sounds like some people go into to define prove God's existence when they think that God's existence is like a feeling that you get when you hear pretty music. So while I bristled at this reading, I also kind of took away from it, I need to know my theology better. And we as Christians need to have some more common ground universally about who God is.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a great point where he starts off that paragraph that Dad mentioned before, where that there's not a unified definition of what God is. Now, can we achieve that? Is that's not really something that's really possible. A reasonable.
No, but we could at least have common language. I think that if people of faith had a common language, it might be at least a better argument. I don't think it's up to us to prove the existence of God, but maybe to be able to talk about it a little bit more intelligently. Sorry, I can't take. I'm so tired. I've been staring at screens all day, but I wanted to share that.
No, I appreciate Sarah saying that she bristled at this, because my gut feeling was, after reading it several times, that he's not only denying our Judeo-Christian background in saying that this concept of God, his concept is without natural powers, without causing emotions of love and joy, without sacred liturgy or characteristics, without metaphysical attributes, must be concrete, but not like the biblical accounts, not like the unmoved mover, not able to care about humans. And it made me sick, because he's negating even pagan concepts of God. It's like his concept of himself is so limited. It was really hard to read, but thank you, Sarah, because it made me bristle too. I mean, it's like we've regressed. I mean, if you can stomach watching the media, that attitude shows a real regression in our understanding of human dignity and caring about fellow man. Anyway, I'll shut up, because you get the point.
Well, and you're right, and his philosophy extends to ethics as well. So, which means that because he believes really only in empirical truth, and he doesn't believe that ethical principles fall under the category of empirical truth, that there's no way to come to any kind of natural law, any kind of any basic ethical principles. That basically he'll say that we should argue for them, but there's really no ultimate basis for them.
If I could follow up with what was just being said, I think a lot of times these things are structured attacks on Christianity dressed up in language, philosophical language. But the attack is the basis for the thought as opposed to things that thought out and then come to conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when said we should have a unified idea of God, well, I mean, God is God, and we're not going to have a perfect idea of God. But if he can attack you on that, and he can attack you on the other things he does simply by positing them or mispositing them, he will. I mean, one reason I asked, who is this fellow? And a lot of times there's self-interest in these types of things. A lot of times there's self-interest in your various philosophers, the ones you've been pointing to. If you look back at their lives, you see where their thought came from.
Well, he even says as much at the beginning of his writing that, you know, in order to get a bunch of clicks and interests, it's good to say that God doesn't exist. So he goes, you know, he's like, yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty open about it.
I want to point out here a few things that should be more red flags for us. Let's see.
Oh, I thought one thing that he said that was kind of funny. He said, you know, if you believe that God is the love that you have for another person, and he uses that as like a counterexample. It's like, oh, wait, you're on the right track. Because
Right.
God is love. So keep going with that.
Right.
I mean, I know he says it to be cheeky, but we should have picked
Yeah.
a different word.
Okay, so he's talking in this paragraph about motion and about the first cause argument.
Mhm.
Now, he's what he thinks, his characterization again of Aquinas here is that that we believe, that Aquinas believes that God is constantly pushing things that are in motion. So that's the idea that he is attacking. So and then he counters that with Newton. But of course, that's not Aquinas's position, nor was it Aristotle's. So he says,
My point is he probably understands that.
I'm sorry?
He probably understands that's not Aquinas' position too.
No, I think that he believes that is Aquinas' position, and that's what he's expressing here. But again, this is an example of him not actually engaging, not actually looking up the arguments, but reading summaries.
This is a credentialed, well thought of modern philosopher, you say.
Philosopher, no. Physicist, yes.
Yeah, he's not. That's where I was coming back before. I mean, the more I read about scientists trying to get into how did the universe start, this kind of stuff, they show their really sloppy philosophical viewpoints.
Yes. Yeah. And here, and basically ignore the fact that they have presuppositions for their methods. And again, this is not all scientists, but those who venture into philosophical territory without a deeper consideration. Here's an example. We should be good empiricists, but why? Why should we be good empiricists? So that's a statement that needs to be defended, because he's using this as an ultimate foundation for truth, empirical truth. So I'm not saying that empiricism is wrong, but that if he's going to make a statement like this and use it as an example of of this is how we can find God, then his method, the method needs to be defended. Again, he uses conventional scientific methods.
Right.
Well, is it convention that makes something a good method or not? Or is it something deeper?
And it's just pure scientism, just saying science is the judge of
Yeah.
everything, including God.
Right.
This gets into your question about God as a hypothesis to be empirically tested,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically what we've been talking about here for the last couple minutes.
Right. Nonsense.
And I something that occurred to me here towards the end too. I could imagine a universe in which evidence for the existence of God were quite manifest. And this just made me think of the parable of the poor man Lazarus, who died and went to heaven, and then the master who fed him scraps, or who gave him scraps from his table, went to hell and said, well, can you please send somebody to my brothers to tell them? And the response to that is, well, if they wouldn't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to listen to this messenger either. So I think that's, I just throw that out there, something that occurred to me when I read this, that just because Carroll can imagine a universe, he thinks, in which evidence for the existence of God, his kind of God, is quite manifest, that doesn't mean that universe would be better. That if God exists, that it would have to be that kind of universe. Okay, and then just briefly, I'm going to go through about the problem of evil here. I'm going to point to one, probably the most common formulation of it here, the second one. If an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God exists, then evil doesn't. But there's evil in the world, therefore such a being does not exist. So what are some of your thoughts or comments on the problem of evil?
Well, I think Augustine puts another clause in there. Evil could only exist if a benevolent God had a good reason to have evil in the world in order to bring out even more goodness.
Yeah, so I think what you're pointing out there too from Augustine is going down here, that the problem of evil, it doesn't address the other arguments from natural reason for the existence of God. Natural reason shows us that an omnipotent God exists, and then we recognize that that in infinite wisdom he made a world, as the Catechism says, in a state of journeying toward its ultimate perfection, including creatures with the possibility of choosing evil. But that doesn't disprove the existence of God. Now, there have been many attempts throughout theological and philosophical history to justify God against accusations of being distant or uncaring. I think that really the best answer to this is a Christian life. And this quote from the Catechism in yellow here: only Christian faith as a whole constitutes the answer to this question. There is not a single aspect of the Christian message that is not in part an answer to the question of evil. This is not ultimately a question to be settled by pure reason.
Because insofar as you take these as quick questions, there's also a quick answer. I mean, because in a sense they're structured ifs, where you read into the words what you think they mean. Come to his conclusion that the trick for the quick answer, of course, is evil does not exist. Evil is the absence of good.
Mhm.
It's a negative thing, not a positive thing. It doesn't have an existence of its own.
Right.
So
Yeah, that
evil does not exist.
um, I think that evil doesn't have unqualified existence. Um, it exists as a lack. But I think that, yeah, I think that's, of course, a definitely an important approach if somebody has the time and patience to go through the arguments of the fact that evil is not a thing in itself, but a lack of something. And that in itself can turn into an argument for the existence of God.
And I'd say omnipotent, if an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God exists and evil does not, well, that has you sitting in judgment on what is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. Gives you a knowledge that is greater than God's. And it's a trick. It's a structured argument that it's missing something.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. That assumes that we can actually comprehend what all of this means, and that it would imply what it would imply for a being to have those attributes.
Not only that, and then we can judge it.
Right. So just a few things here. Let's take a look briefly at two things. One is going to be the excerpt from Descartes, his ontological argument. So how does this argument work? How does he draw a parallel here with either the he uses a couple different examples. He uses a triangle example, triangle and its attributes. He uses highlands and lowlands. He uses a river and riverbanks. And then he draws a parallel here between God's essence and existence. Structurally similar to St. Anselm's argument we looked at before. So for example, he says, I can't, he says, just as having 180 degrees is something that absolutely must come along with the very concept of a triangle, so also existence can't be separated from God's essence. Or just as a river, you can't think of a river without banks, so you can't think of God and existence separately. Or just as you can't think of highlands apart from lowlands, so existence can't be separated from the essence of God. Are these things related? Is essence related to God in a similar way to highlands and lowlands, or to having angles equal to 180 degrees is to a triangle?
I'm not sure what you're asking. Are you saying that a triangle by definition must always have 180 degrees, therefore that's a triangle, all interior angles of a triangle always equal 180 degrees? You can't separate that from the definition of a triangle. Is that what you're saying?
So yeah, so and that's what Descartes is saying. What he's saying is that you can't, when you consider a triangle, we could simplify it. We could just say having three angles. We could say that when you think of a triangle, having three angles can't help but come along with that. And when you have the concept of God, necessary existence can't help but come along with that. Therefore, everybody who has a concept of God actually believes God exists.
I felt like in a weird way, this kind of was related to the what was his name? Sean, what was his last name?
Carroll?
Carroll reading, and that Descartes is creating some rules or some metrics by which he can measure God, and then saying, okay, well, since I can operate within these metrics, then God exists. Or, you know, it's like the other side of the coin of Sean Carroll saying, well, I'm going to use this scientific set of metrics to prove that God doesn't exist. And we're, at the end of the day, we're going to be limited because we can't do the math or make the science experiment one way or another to really prove the existence of God to ourselves.
So I think that's a good point. Now, if this argument were valid, then the necessary existence, absolute necessary existence, and God's full essence would immediately hit you with the same force whenever I say God, as the number 4 would hit you with that force when I say 2 + 2, right? It would be that kind of equivalent, that it would have that tautology that you wouldn't be able to avoid. But of course, as Aquinas has pointed out in his argument, of course, many people do separate these concepts in their mind. And the reason we can do that is because the kind of existence that we understand isn't God's existence. If we understood truly necessary existence, there would be no need to argue for the existence of God, because immediately upon understanding it, all other things would be resolved into that as their cause. Oh, Jerry, your sound's off.
To put it in different words, it is a 2 + 2 proposition. We just don't completely understand that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there are some things that are, and St. Thomas explains this too in another part of, in that same question of the Summa, in a different article. He says that there are some things that are self-evident to us and some things that are self-evident in themselves, but not self-evident to us. The connection of God's essence to his existence is self-evident in itself, but it is not self-evident to us. Not until, that is, we see God face to face. The proposition 2 + 2 = 4 is self-evident in itself and self-evident to us. So that's a good point, Jerry.
So, John, these atheists that we've discussed tonight, they use themselves as a reference point when they talk about God. They're self-referencing as if they're not a creature, that they're their own creator. But it seems to me like it's a dead end, and it's so depressing. And I'm just surprised, and I don't understand how they can take the inheritance that we have. I mean, this guy lived in the 1500s. I mean, how can he reject God? Wasn't he ever evangelized or
So
catechized?
Descartes does not reject God. Descartes he's arguing for God's existence. In fact, his whole purpose in his meditations on first philosophy is to argue for God's existence. So this is,
He's Catholic, isn't he?
yes, he was Jesuit educated, and his meditations were inspired by the process of Ignatian meditation and of the spiritual exercises. So what we're looking at here is a good attempt, but what he does in the process, starting with his first meditation, is decide that because there are so many arguments and disagreement in metaphysics over how many centuries, I'm just going to throw it out and start over. And in the process, he comes up with a couple arguments for the existence of God. Now, following him, another major philosopher who will react to him, to Descartes' rationalism, is John Locke. And Catherine, in terms of self-reference, I think this is important here because John Locke will have arguments about regarding God's essence and existence. Basically, that we get to the idea of God by augmenting things that the attributes of ourselves that we encounter to an infinite degree, and kind of imagining that onto infinity. So that would go against the Thomistic and Aristotelian notion of analogy, where there's something essentially different in God's goodness from ours. God's goodness is not just an infinite augmentation of ours, of an attribute, but it's his essence.
When you get to Locke and the others, you get the philosophers who are outside of the Catholic tradition, the Protestants. They're trying to justify something else.
Yeah, that's true also. So at that point, we're looking at different theological traditions that are the source of those Christian philosophers.
Were there people in the Catholic Church who were trying to refute Descartes? Because I read online that he was killed in Stockholm by a priest who gave him arsenic in a communion wafer. Is that if that's true, is it because he was starting to start all over and think from scratch? And
So I don't know if I've never heard that story before. Maybe it is true, but yes, immediately upon the publication of his Meditations, there were quite a few reactions and letters written to him, and you can find all this online if you go to the link on the very first page of the readings to earlymoderntexts.com. You can look at Descartes' full Meditations. You can see some of the responses to those, where he's getting in discussions with other philosophers who are trying to argue against his conclusions.
so he did live in the time of Ignatius of Loyola.
A little after.
A little after? Okay, that's cool. Thank you.
Okay, so one very brief final thing. In the existentialist tradition, I want to talk about two philosophers here. First, Kierkegaard, who's kind of considered the first existentialist. And I've talked about this proposition of his: truth is subjectivity. Now, he doesn't mean truth is subjective. What he means is that truth is not just an abstract thing, but to have the truth is to embrace it with one's inward life. So truth is tied up with my very existence. And if it isn't, then I don't have the truth. Now, he was reacting to the philosopher Hegel, who interpreted all of history and all of religion and God in a very distant, objective way. And he made it fit this neat little system of his. And Kierkegaard is trying to argue that that you need to embrace the truth, embrace religious truth with full force in your inward life, not make it a pure object of study. So another parallel to this, I've mentioned before, the philosopher Marcel, the 20th century. He distinguishes between a problem versus a mystery. A problem, etymologically, is something that is cast in my path, and it's something outside me. An example, okay, how far is it to get to the moon? That's a problem. That's something that's not really tied up to me. I can set that out in front of me and solve it. But a mystery is something from which I cannot extricate myself for investigation. What is being, or what is God? Now, if being is something that I'm tied up with, I can't separate myself from being to look at it. If God is an ultimate cause of me, if his existence permeates mine in some way, then I can't investigate God the same way I do scientific propositions or means true belief. It means living according to that truth of God's existence. And it is only in that way that I can have real proof of God's existence, is by the experience of God at the level of my existence. So to Marcel, the problem of evil would be a misnomer. Because trying to solve things rationally, trying to solve the problem of evil rationally, and I think we get a bit of this from that quote from the Catechism I mentioned too. To try to do it on pure reason would enable us to falsely separate ourselves from it, but it is tied up into the whole Christian mystery.
So is Marcel a believer?
Yes, I don't think he was Catholic, but he was Christian.
And what about Kierkegaard?
Yes, Kierkegaard was Lutheran.
He was?
Yeah.
Okay. And how about Hegel? Is he a good guy or bad guy? He's a bad guy, right?
Well,
He's an unbeliever. I don't expect you to say bad guy.
No, he was Christian as well, but his philosophy, he makes religion and God a tool of his philosophy rather than the other way around.
Most of the Germans come out of Lutheranism. Most of your English speakers come out of the Whig segment of British.
Does anybody know of a book that has a timeline of all the philosophers throughout time?
Well, I think I don't think there's a book like that.
Okay.
Because there have been quite a few philosophers. But
Right. I know.
I would look at, I mentioned earlier in the seminar, the History of Philosophy podcast.
Okay.
And that would be a great place to start for getting a lot of key philosophers throughout history. Next week,
Okay.
I'll be touching on the most important philosophers for our purposes, starting with Descartes up to that. So
Okay.
get some more there. All right. Any other questions?
Well, I just, prior to listening to Father Spitzer the last 2 weeks, I'd never heard of the BVG theorem or any of that. And then when I saw your dad's notes, I did a little more research, and Alexander Valenkin is still living. And it was very helpful for me. There's a 8 or 10 minute video of him being interviewed by another physicist, philosopher. And in the very end, he explains the whole theory, the theorem, and how it was proved. And he does it very simply. It's not hard, but he said, for physicists, a vacuum is a state of energy and pressure. He said, but I am not talking within a vacuum in regards to the existence of God. He said, we started with the laws of physics and general relativity and quantum mechanics. And he says, these laws are assumed to exist in some Platonic sense, even prior to the universe, although prior is in quotes, since there is no time. And his last sentence was, the very intriguing question that we had when we solved this is, why these laws? Why these laws? Who gives these laws? And he goes, it's a deep mystery. So, and Spitzer said after the VG theorem that 57%, as your dad said, of all scientists now believe in a creator, a designer, creative designer of the universe. And he said now 80% of doctors admit that there is an intelligent designer of the universe because of these theories. I guess people with intelligence are following these. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate, John, you introducing us to this. It's really changed my life, as hard as it's been to study this. I'm embarrassed at my age that I never knew it, but if more people my age understood this, I don't think we'd be in the mess that we are in today. As Sarah was saying earlier, we need a language and a vocabulary to defend our faith. And it's in this course, really, I'm learning it. So anyway, thank you.
Great. Anybody else?
Well, in one sense, we use the word law two different ways. When you get the laws of logic of it, they're inflexible no matter what. 2 plus 2 equals 4. The laws of nature don't have to be what they are. They could be different. I mean, they're only observations about what happens. But that doesn't have to be, or it didn't have to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that goes to the arguments from the fine tuning of constants.
But also goes to the statement that we make the assumption that those laws are applied some sort of Platonic sense, that they're just out there.
Uh-huh.
Well, they aren't just out there.
Right.
They don't have to be. They are what God put.
Yeah.
I think Marty brought up last. Go ahead, Gary.
I was going to say 2 plus 2 is 4. God, in a sense, can't contradict that. That is part of reason. That is God. He is reason. He is logos. On the other hand, gravity, that's not part of reason. That's something that's been created. I think it was somebody mentioned it before. Hawkins, give me gravity and I can explain everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why give him gravity?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole philosophical error. Gravity isn't like 2 plus 2. I can give you 2 plus 2. That has to be true. Gravity doesn't have to be.
I think Marty mentioned last class about one of the scientists that have been converted. There are major scientists now that are converting because of the physics that's occurring. And I went back and looked at there's tons of them, and it's happening all over, and they're basically looking at the proofs, and they're just looking at the proofs, and they're taking that final leap. And most of these, when you really go back and start looking at their stories, they had some preconceived notion of how the universe began, and then they tried to fit their physics into it, just like Einstein did. He put the fudge factor into his original equations of the universe, because he just assumed that it was an infinite thing. But then Lemaitre came along and fixed them. So there have been great, and to tell you, Einstein was probably the greatest of the converts that we have. And I don't know, you start talking about the society that we're in today. A lot of people don't want to talk about the successes. They only want to talk about the failures. But there've been a lot of successes, and they continue to happen as people like Spitzer and that get out and interview these people. There's an organization of Catholic scientists right now that Spitzer started a couple of years ago, and it's interesting because the head of the department at Catholic universities, I don't know, the College of Science or whatever it is, found out that he wasn't qualified to be a member of this, because he was telling me. He says, I'm not allowed in it because I'm not an active scientist. I don't do research right now. And Spitzer and Barr, the two of them together, are doing this. They want people that are actively doing this, so that they could better promote what's out there and have these scientific discussions. And I think